During this, in this SPSS podcast, we're going to look very briefly at the data that you'll be using for your assignment. As part of this assignment, you'll have the opportunity to take part in a psychological test which looks at the measurement of human bias and attitudes. And psychologists have long been interested in the measurement of human attitudes, and attitudes reflect a general evaluation of a class of individuals or objects. And despite the inherent drawbacks, psychologists have traditionally used self-report measures to measure attitudes. But researchers have begun to use less direct measures of attitudes and trying to look more at the cognitive processes that underlie judgments to see if we can actually glean more useful information about what people actually think rather than what they say that they think. So Grenwald pioneered the use of implicit association tests to measure the relative ease at which people can make associations between certain groups of people, for example, older adults, and concepts such as goodness and badness. Ease of association is measured by the judgment speed, and it's taken as evidence as an implicitly held attitude towards a particular social group. So, for example, researchers would interpret the finding that people are quicker to associate the term good and the term younger rather than the term old as evidence of a generally held bias in favour of youth. So the implicit association method is useful for measuring a variety of attitudes, including bias in gender, race, political constructs, for example. The version of the IAT test in this experiment measures implicit associations of race, and this was one of the first topics investigated by the developers. Many people are surprised at the results of the implicit association test. Someone may not hold explicit biases on race, yet still pair good terms more quickly with faces representing one race more than another. Most often, particularly when the participant is white, the bias is in the direction of the stereotype congruent pairing, when white faces are paired with good words and black faces are paired with bad words. This type of activity illustrates the pervasiveness and potential This type of activity illustrates the pervasiveness and subtlety of cultural stereotypes in our society and provides an opportunity for the discussion of factors that might underlie performance on this test, as well as the nature of constructs that a test purports to measure. So let's look at your data. The first column simply provides a participant identification number, or the number that each person receives upon the completion of the experiment. Data in columns 2 and 3 are relatively self-explanatory. They relate to age and gender. The column labelled preference is an indication of how the person reported their feelings about individuals based on race. If the participant declined to indicate his or her warmth towards a group, you will see that word decline in the column next to the participant's information. The possible values represent the following conditions. 1 is I strongly prefer whites to blacks. 2 is I moderately prefer whites to blacks. 3, I like whites and blacks equally. 4, I moderately prefer blacks to whites. And 5, I strongly prefer blacks to whites. And you can flick between the numbers and the actual labels by using this column here, this button here. In the column labelled warmth, participants reported how warmly they feel towards each group, and the ratings range from 0 to 10 being the warmest, and the warmer number is the difference between the two ratings made on the black and white scales. If the difference of the score is positive, it means that the warmth score was greater for whites than blacks. Negative scores imply more warmth towards blacks, and scores of 0 indicate equal warmth towards both races. Each one of these lines represents a participant. These are a participant's demographics. So the description is the participant who took part, their gender, their age, and that's just their user ID. And this is their preference towards blacks and whites and how warmth that they felt towards those groups. They also took part in these two conditions, and these conditions are therefore related in some way. In previous examples, there has been no relationship between two variables. So these are paired in some way. So that is something very important that you've got to take into consideration when you're running your statistical analysis and choosing the correct test.